Hello, and welcome to What's That Behind You. In today's story, we're going to be discussing the Hammersmith ghost. What happens when a ghost hunt turns to murder? Throughout this story, we're going to hear tales of ghostly apparitions harming and hurting the locals of Hammersmith, London, starting in 1803. And changing the way we look at our judicial service forever. How can a ghost hunt turn so wrong? In 1803, long before the glass towers, tube trains and bumper-to-bumper traffic of the modern metropolis, London was a very different city. It was the tough, dirty and chaotic capital of Europe. A place where hackney coaches clattered across crowded cobbled streets, where the smell of soot and open sewers permeated the air, where bare-knuckle boxing and public executions passed for viable forms of entertainment. It's a time and a place that many of us have etched into our subconscious. We've seen it in films and the monochrome sketches of time-yellowed history books. Oil lamps spilling light over the narrow, dingy alleyways. A thick smog clinging heavily to the damp and dirty ground. Shadows that hide shadows within shadows. The perfect setting for a ghost story. It was on the outskirts of this London, a few decades before Spring-Heeled Jack would bound across the rooftops, and almost a full century before Jack the Ripper would terrorise the residents of Whitechapel, that a very different evil haunted the borough of Hammersmith. One such incident took place at 10 o'clock one late November evening. That night, a local woman crossed the churchyard on her way home, a routine she carried out most nights, although now less comfortably than ever. As her eyes attempted to adjust to the moonless night, something drew to her attention. Not a sight as such, nor a sound, but a feeling. Something based in primal fear, instinctual even. Her body sending a warning. She looked around, her pulse quickening slightly, and at first saw nothing. Then, in among the hedgerows and headstones, tangled in the evening mist, something moved. Struggling against the weight of superstition, she began to recall stories of the ghost, the stagecoach driver who'd fled as it approached from the field, the pregnant woman who just days before had been attacked on that very path that she now stood. Images of burial shrouds, goat horns and dead, glass eyes circled through her mind as slowly she watched as a white form began to rise from the ground. For a brief moment, she may have dared to imagine that her mind was playing tricks on her, and then she started to run, stumbling over uneven ground in a panic stride. As her heartbeat kept time with her footsteps, she allowed herself a single glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the apparition had gone, but it hadn't. It was right on top of her. Hours later, some local residents found the woman unconscious in the churchyard. They took her home and led her to bed, where in a state of semi-coherence she recounted her story, leaving her to rest. The neighbours returned to their own homes, speaking in hushed voices about things they barely dare mention. They didn't know then that the woman would never recover from her encounter or even wake from her sleep. Many of the villagers took matters into their own hands and took up patrols at night in hopes of catching or viewing and deterring the ghost. They walked the streets in pairs, but the many alleyways and lanes made the chase impossible. Many of the men said they had sighted the ghoul whilst on their walks, some trying to remain brave and say that it was nothing but a man in a sheet, but these people still wouldn't walk the streets alone. More residents from Hammersmith soon became wary of this ghost, one being a young man by the name of Thomas Groom. This incident was no doubt playing on the mind of Thomas Groom the night he walked through the Hammersmith churchyard, returning from his job at a local brewery. He knew of the rumours well. Talk amongst the residents had drawn some speculative conclusions. Some said the spirit was a man who had taken his own life in the neighbourhood a year before. His body was buried within the churchyard on consecrated grounds, an act that was illegal for suicide victims until 1882. Others claimed it was a poltergeist that had been wreaking havoc on the town for some while. But if Groom was worried, he wasn't worried enough to change his route home, or even keep pace with his co-worker who had strode several yards ahead. In fact, his own recounting has him walking with his coat tucked under his arm and his hands in his pockets, hardly the actions of a man afraid. Perhaps he had dismissed the stories of folklore. If that was the case, his mind would soon change. The churchyard was dark that night, as it would have been most nights. An impenetrable mass of shadows that flickered and twitched as clouds lazily shuffled across a dim moon. As Groom walked the narrow path, straining to see where he had placed his feet, something emerged from the blackness behind him, placed both hands around his throat and squeezed. Groom struggled, letting out a startled cry that attracted the attention of his colleague. "What is it?" the other brewer asked the darkness. But there was no answer. Before Groom could respond, the spirit spun him around and released his neck. Groom struck out and felt something soft, like a great coat, he would later testify. But he seen nothing but night. But how can a hunt for a ghost end in murder? Following the nights, the police scoured the streets of London nearly every night in the brisk cold, walking through with their guns by their sides. Armed police patrolled in search of the spectre, looking for any sight of the deadly spirit. That night, one of the men patrolling the neighbourhood was Francis Smith, a 29-year-old customs officer described by all that knew him as mild-mannered and good-natured. Not a disposition fitting a man intending to hunt an evil entity. That night he spotted a figure, all dressed in white from head to toe. The young officer raised his pistol and yelled a warning to the ghoul, but to no avail. The officer, with his weapon already drawn, shot bullets into the night through sure will alone. Past his fright, he managed to hit the apparition, and down it went. The officer rushed over to the side of the road, only to find the very human Thomas Millward lay dead on Black Lion Lane. Just yards away from his family cottage, he had left the house to collect his wife from work, wearing a white gown traditional in his trade as a plasterer. By strange coincidence, this wasn't the first time Millward had been mistaken for the spirit. The previous Saturday he had told his wife that he accidentally frightened two ladies and a gentleman travelling by horse and drawn cart. The gentleman passenger had called out, "There goes the ghost," to which Millward had replied that he was no more ghost than he was, and offered to punch him in the head as proof. When hearing of this, Millward's wife had begged him to change his dress. "Thomas," she said, "there is a piece of work about the ghost, and your clothes look white. Pray, do put on your great coat that you may not run into any danger." In response, Millward simply mumbled something about wishing the ghost was caught. He never did put on his coat, and he never got chance to again. On January the 13th, 1804, Francis Smith was tried for the murder of Thomas Millward. 12 character witnesses gave testimony to his good nature and spoke of the fear that engulfed the Tameside town, but it wasn't enough. Smith was sentenced to death and dissection the following Monday. Speaking in his defence, Smith said, "My lord, I went out with good intention, and when this unhappy affair took place, I did not know what I did. Speaking to the deceased twice, and him not answering, I was so agitated, I did not know what I did. I solemnly declare my innocence, and that I had no intention to take away the life of the unfortunate deceased, or any other man whatsoever. If Smith had been executed, it would have been the third life taken by the spirit, seemingly born of rumour, but on the 25th of January he received a reprieve. His sentence was commuted to a year's imprisonment. The case exposed the issue of there being a lack of available defence for someone who believes that their action, even violent action, is necessary and acts in good faith, but is mistaken about the situation. The issue haunted the courts until 1983, when the case of R.V. Williams came before the Court of Appeal. The judge finally clarified the law, holding that, in a case of self-defence, where self-defence or the prevention of crime is concerned, if the jury came to the conclusion that the defendant believed or may have believed that he was being attacked or that a crime was being committed, that the force was necessary to protect himself or prevent the crime, then prosecution have not proved their case. If, however, the defendant's alleged belief was mistaken, and if the mistake was an unreasonable one, that may be a peaceful reason for coming to the conclusion that the belief was not honestly held and should be rejected. Even if the jury come to the conclusion that the mistake was an unreasonable one, if the defendant may generally have been labouring under it, he is entitled to rely upon it. It could be said that the final put the ghost to rest. Unfortunately for poor Millwood, however, there have been reports that his spirit still lingers in Hammersmith pub, to which he carried after he was shot and killed. But by definition, Francis Smith began the case of self-defence, and actually using self-defence as a defence in court. But this was not cleared up, as I said a second ago, till 1983. One of the major reasons why Smith got his reprieve to a year imprisonment. Some say if you travel the streets late at night in the festive period, the vision of a ghost dressed all in white can be seen. More interestingly, sightings of a plasterer have also been recorded walking the streets of Hammersmith. All we know is that the hunt for the ghost of Hammersmith led to the death of a very real man, whose soul could still be searching these earthly planes for answers. If you've enjoyed this video, please drop it a like. If you like the format of this video, please subscribe for more. There are more coming out every single Monday. But if you are ever walking the streets of Hammersmith and spot the man in white, if you are ever walking around the area and hear someone shout stop, please remember that you don't have to be afraid of what's behind you.